The hidden years of Jesus. What happened between the ages of 12 and 30? Before the miracles, before the crowds, before walking on water, Jesus woke up early to work. His hands knew the weight of wood, the smell of sawdust, the sweat of an ordinary day. For nearly 2 decades, the man who would be called the Son of God lived like any other Galilean of his time. And it is exactly this period that the Gospels almost ignore. Before continuing with the video, do you want to strengthen your prayer life and still help our channel grow? I have prepared a material with more than 50 special prayers to guide you. Click the link in the description and help our project spread the word of Christ. 18 years. This is the interval between the last appearance of Jesus as a child and the beginning of his public ministry. The Gospels record the 12-year-old boy debating with doctors of the law in the Temple of Jerusalem. Luke describes how Mary and Joseph, after 3 days of anguished searching, found their son sitting among the masters, asking questions that left experienced men without answers. After this scene, the sacred text jumps nearly 2 decades. The next record shows Jesus already an adult, at 30 years old, descending into the waters of the Jordan River to be baptized by John. What happened between these 2 moments? Why did the Bible choose silence? Think of the setting. Nazareth was not Jerusalem. It was not even a medium-sized city. It was a village of approximately 400 inhabitants, nestled in the hills of Lower Galilee, about 150 kilometers north of the religious capital of Israel. It is not mentioned in any book of the Old Testament. It does not appear in the writings of Flavius Josephus, the greatest Jewish historian of the 1st century. It does not appear in any rabbinic record of the time. Modern archaeological excavations revealed a modest agricultural community, with simple houses partially carved into the limestone rock of the hills, cisterns to store rainwater, and small cultivation terraces on the slopes. When Nathanael first heard of Jesus, his reaction was revealing. Can anything good come from Nazareth? The question was not merely rhetorical. It reflected the contempt that inhabitants of larger cities felt for that forgotten village. Nazareth was off the main trade routes. It had no prestigious synagogue. It produced no famous scribes. It was the kind of place that ambitious people left at the first opportunity. It was in this insignificant place that the future master lived most of his earthly life. Not in marble palaces, not in schools of scribes in Jerusalem, not in the corridors of the temple where great theological questions were debated, but in a rural community where everyone knew everyone by name, where news traveled slowly, and where manual labor defined the identity and value of each family. Christian tradition preserved a significant detail. Jesus was a tekton. The Greek word appears in Mark chapter 6, verse 3, and was translated as carpenter, but its meaning is broader. Tekton designated artisans who worked with wood and stone, builders capable of erecting everything from simple furniture like tables and benches to more complex structures like roofs, doors, and even small buildings. Joseph practiced this craft, and as was custom among first-century Jews, the son learned the father's profession from an early age, generally starting at 5 or 6 years old. Imagine what this meant in daily practice. Waking up before the sun rose, when the Galilean air still carried the freshness of the night. Walking to the workshop, probably a room attached to the family home or an outdoor space protected by an awning. Selecting logs, evaluating the quality of the wood, identifying defects that would compromise the work, measuring planks with precision using ropes and marked rods, cutting beams with bronze or iron saws, a slow and exhausting process, smoothing surfaces with adzes until they were smooth to the touch, fitting pieces together using techniques passed down from generation to generation, the smell of cedar and oak permeating the clothes, sawdust accumulating in the hair and beard, thick calluses on the palms of the hands, frequent splinters under the nails, back pain after hours hunched over a piece of work, accidental cuts that left scars on the fingers. This was the daily life of the man who would later heal paralytics with a word and raise the dead with a touch. But there was more than manual labor in those silent years. The religious formation of a young Jew followed well-defined patterns passed down over centuries. At 5 years old, the study of the Torah began, the 5 books of Moses, learning to recognize Hebrew letters and pronounce the sacred words. At 10, he advanced to the Mishnah, the oral tradition that interpreted the written law and applied its principles to daily situations. At 13, in the ceremony we today call a bar mitzvah, he assumed personal responsibility for the commandments and began to be counted among the adult men of the community for religious purposes. The synagogue functioned as a community center, school and court. Every Sabbath, without exception, families gathered to hear the reading of the Hebrew scriptures and the commentaries of local masters. The service followed an established order: prayers, reading of the Torah in Hebrew, translation into the Aramaic that the common people understood, reading of the prophets, and a sermon explaining the texts. Any adult man could be called to read or comment. It was a culture of active participation, not of passive spectators. Jesus attended this synagogue for years. He heard the same texts repeated hundreds of times throughout annual reading cycles. He memorized entire psalms, extensive prophecies, detailed historical narratives. Luke records that as an adult, he entered the synagogue of Nazareth on a Sabbath, received the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, found the exact passage he wanted without hesitation, and read with authority that impressed everyone. This does not happen by chance. This is the result of decades of deep immersion in the scriptures. How could a carpenter from a forgotten village know the sacred text so deeply as to debate with doctors in Jerusalem at 12 and silence experienced Pharisees at 30? The answer lies in the hidden years, every day of study in the synagogue, every question asked of local masters, every discussion with other young men about the meaning of a difficult passage, every night meditating alone on what he had learned. The knowledge that Jesus would demonstrate in his public ministry did not arise from nothing. It was built brick by brick, verse by verse, throughout nearly 3 decades of silent and invisible preparation. Consider the political situation of Galilee during that turbulent period. Rome had dominated the region since 63 years before Christ, when General Pompey conquered Jerusalem after a brutal siege. The territory was divided into provinces and tetrarchies, governed by a combination of Roman authorities and puppet kings of the Herodian dynasty. Taxes were brutal, designed to extract as much as possible from the subjugated population. Modern historians estimate that between 40 and 70% of agricultural production was consumed by tributes to the empire, religious fees for the temple, and contributions to local rulers. Herod Antipas, son of the Herod who ordered the massacre of children in Bethlehem, ruled Galilee throughout Jesus' youth. This was the same ruler who would later order the beheading of John the Baptist for criticizing his illicit marriage to his sister-in-law, and who would mock Jesus during his trial in Jerusalem. Antipas was known for his political cunning and calculated cruelty. Jesus would later call him a fox, a term that was not a compliment. The shadow of Roman power and Herodian corruption hung over every village, every family, every worker trying to survive on the little that remained after the tax collectors. Jesus grew up seeing this up close. He saw neighbors lose ancestral lands to unpayable debts. He saw families separated when fathers were sold as slaves to pay relentless creditors. He saw widows evicted from their homes by creditors who had no compassion. He saw orphans abandoned with no one to protect them. He saw Roman soldiers marching along the dusty roads, their armor gleaming in the sun, reminding everyone who truly ruled in that land promised to the patriarchs. This experience shaped the parables he would tell later. Stories full of indebted servants who owed impossible amounts, absentee landlords who left vineyards in the care of exploitative workers, relentless kings who demanded accountability, unjust judges who only attended to those who persisted, dishonest managers who falsified records. It was not abstract theory learned from books. It was real life observed day after day during formative decades. The Gospels mention that Jesus had brothers and sisters. Matthew chapter 13 lists 4 brothers by name: James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. The sisters are not named, as was the custom of the time regarding women, but the plural indicates at least 2. This means a family of at least 7 children, possibly more, sustained by the work of an artisan in a poor village of a region occupied by a foreign empire. The family dynamics of those years remain shrouded in silence. What we know is that Joseph disappears completely from the biblical narrative after the episode in the temple. He is not mentioned at Jesus' baptism, nor in the miracles that followed, nor in the preachings, nor at the crucifixion. Mary appears alone on several important occasions. Christian tradition generally assumes that Joseph died at some point during the hidden years, possibly when Jesus was still a teenager. If this happened, Jesus would have assumed the responsibility of the firstborn. In Jewish culture, this was no empty honor. It meant becoming the head of the family, caring for the widowed mother, helping to support younger siblings until they could establish themselves, negotiating marriages for the sisters, keeping the workshop running to ensure income, representing the family in legal transactions and community disputes. It was a considerable weight for young shoulders. Observe what this implies. The same man who would later tell a follower to let the dead bury their dead probably spent years caring for a family grieving the loss of their father. The master who would teach about not storing up treasures on earth worked day after day to ensure bread on the table of his home. He who would say that foxes have holes, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, spent decades living in the same simple house in Nazareth. There is a human depth in these silent years that the Gospels do not detail, but which shines through in every gesture of compassion in his public ministry. First-century Galilee was a region of striking contrasts. To the south lay Samaria, a zone of ethnic and religious tension with the Jews, where ancient hostilities still simmered. To the east, beyond the Jordan and the Sea of Galilee, lay the Decapolis, a confederation of 10 cities of predominantly Greek culture, with pagan temples dedicated to Zeus and Aphrodite, theaters where Hellenistic dramas were staged, and gymnasiums where athletes competed naked according to Greek customs that scandalized pious Jews. To the north, Syrian and Phoenician territories brought even more diverse cultural influences. Sepphoris, one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the region, was only 6 kilometers from Nazareth, about an hour's walk. Tiberias, built by Herod Antipas on the shores of the Sea of Galilee and named in honor of the Roman emperor, represented Herodian power in all its ostentation. Both cities had mixed populations, Jews and Gentiles living in uncomfortable proximity, markets where Greek, Aramaic and Latin were heard mixed together, and standards of living far superior to those of the surrounding rural villages. Some historians speculate that Jesus may have worked in Sepphoris during his youth. The city was in full reconstruction, after being destroyed in a revolt in 4 years before Christ, when Roman soldiers burned houses and enslaved inhabitants as punishment for rebellion. Large construction sites needed skilled artisans. A skilled tekton from a neighboring village could easily find work there for years. If this happened, Jesus would have had direct contact with sophisticated Hellenistic architecture, with merchants of various nationalities, with the complex cultural mix that characterized that cosmopolitan world. But this is speculation based on probabilities, not on direct evidence. The Gospels neither confirm nor deny work in Sepphoris or any other specific location. The silence remains intact. What was happening inside Jesus during these invisible formative years? What was the spiritual life of someone whom Luke describes growing in wisdom, in stature, and in favor with God and men? Some apocryphal texts, written centuries later by authors who wanted to satisfy the curiosity that the canonical Gospels did not satisfy, tried to fill the gaps with fantastic stories. The infancy Gospel of Thomas describes a boy Jesus making clay birds and giving them life with a breath, cursing children who irritated him, casually raising the dead as a demonstration of power. Other texts suggest mysterious journeys to distant places. India, where he would have learned from Eastern sages, Egypt, where he would have been initiated into esoteric knowledge, Essene communities in the Judean desert, where he would have absorbed ascetic disciplines. These narratives reveal more about the insatiable curiosity of later readers than about the historical reality of the first century. There is no credible evidence for any of these theories. The canonical Gospels, written by people who knew Jesus or interviewed eyewitnesses, chose silence regarding these years. And perhaps this silence is more eloquent than 1,000 pages of speculation. Jewish tradition valued the age of 30 as a milestone of full maturity. The Levites could only assume full duties in the temple service from this age, as established in Numbers chapter 4. Joseph of Egypt was 30 years old when he became governor under Pharaoh, according to Genesis chapter 41. David was 30 years old when he began to reign over all Israel, as recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 5. There is a biblical pattern of prolonged preparation before transformative missions. Moses spent 40 years in the Egyptian palace, then 40 years in the desert of Midian shepherding sheep, before finally receiving the call at the burning bush at 80 years old. There were decades of silence between the hasty flight from Egypt and the epic confrontation with Pharaoh. Elijah spent years hidden by the brook Cherith before his prophetic ministry exploded, in confrontation with the prophets of Baal. Paul, after his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, spent years in Arabia and then in Tarsus before beginning his missionary journeys that would transform the Gentile world. The pattern repeats throughout the Scriptures. Great callings require long periods of invisible formation. Jesus was no exception to this divine pattern. Before speaking to the crowds, he listened in silence. Before teaching with authority, he learned with humility. Before leading disciples, he served his family. The 18 years of silence were not wasted emptiness. They were a carefully constructed foundation. Scale this for a moment. When Jesus finally opened his mouth to preach in the synagogues of Galilee, his words were not those of a beginner experimenting with ideas for the first time. They were those of someone who had spent nearly 3 decades observing the human condition up close, reflecting on the meaning of the Scriptures in silence, maturing in intimate communion with the Father. Every parable about seeds falling on different types of soil came from years of seeing farmers planting and harvesting on the slopes of Galilee. Every story about nets cast into the sea carried the experience of knowing fishermen who worked on the nearby lake. Every reference to sheep and shepherds reflected attentive observation of the flocks that grazed on the hills around Nazareth. The confrontation with Pharisees and scribes, which would mark so much of the public ministry, was no momentary improvisation. It carried the surgical precision of one who had studied every detail of the law and the prophets for decades. When Jesus quoted Moses, Isaiah, or the Psalms, he was not consulting notes. He was accessing a reservoir of knowledge accumulated over years of memorization and meditation. The authority that impressed the crowds did not come from nothing. It had been forged in silence. The Sermon on the Mount, with its revolutionary beatitudes and its radical interpretations of the law, was not born in a moment of sudden inspiration as Jesus climbed a hill with disciples. It was born from thousands of hours meditating on the Scriptures in silent dawns. It was born from intimate dialogues with God in prayer that no one witnessed. It was born from years of processing the injustices and sufferings witnessed in occupied Galilee. It was born from decades of observing the gap between what the religious preached and what they practiced. The depth of that teaching reflects the depth of those hidden years. Why do the Gospels not tell more about this formative period? Why did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John choose silence regarding nearly 2 decades of Jesus' life? Perhaps because the purpose of the sacred texts was never to satisfy modern biographical curiosity. The Gospels are proclamation, not biography in the contemporary sense. They focus on what the authors, inspired by the Holy Spirit, considered essential for faith: the message of the kingdom of God, the miraculous signs that confirmed Jesus' identity, the redemptive death on the cross, the victorious resurrection that conquered death. The years of preparation served their purpose by preparing. They did not need to be narrated in detail to fulfill their function in the divine plan. Perhaps also because silence invites personal identification. Jesus lived an apparently ordinary life before living an extraordinary life that changed history. He worked with his hands, studied the Scriptures, suffered family losses, carried domestic responsibilities, faced the monotony of days that seemed the same. Whoever reads the Gospels can recognize themselves in these undescribed years. They can imagine that their own decades of invisible routine, of uncelebrated work, of silent growth, can also be preparation for something greater that they cannot yet see. The final years before the public ministry hold their own mysteries. At some point, Jesus knew it was time to depart. The news of John the Baptist preaching in the Judean desert, on the banks of the Jordan River, reached Galilee and stirred hearts everywhere. Crowds descended from the villages to the Jordan Valley, publicly confessing sins, being immersed in the waters as a sign of repentance and preparation for something new that was to come. Something was happening in the history of Israel. Messianic expectation, always latent in the oppressed Jewish heart, gained new intensity with the thundering preaching of the prophet of the desert. Jesus left Nazareth. He left the carpenter's workshop with its familiar tools. He left the brothers who perhaps did not understand his decision. He left the mother who had kept all these things in her heart since the angel's announcement. He walked the 120 kilometers of dusty roads to the Jordan Valley. He passed through Samaria or bypassed through the Jordan Valley, as did Jews who wanted to avoid Samaritan territory. He descended the slopes to the lowest point on the earth's surface, where the river meandered among date palms before flowing into the Dead Sea. He joined the line of sinners waiting for baptism. He did not identify himself as different. He did not claim privileges. He did not announce who he was. He simply waited his turn like any other repentant Galilean. And when John saw him approaching, something happened. The prophet who confronted crowds with boldness hesitated. "I need to be baptized by thee, and comest thou to me?" But Jesus insisted, "Suffer it to be so now, for thus it becometh us to fulfill all righteousness." And when he emerged from the waters of the Jordan, the heavens opened in a way that those present could witness. The Spirit of God descended in visible form like a dove, lighting upon him, and a voice thundered from heaven, audible to those who had ears to hear. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The silent years ended at that moment on the banks of the river. The 3 years that would change the history of humanity began. But nothing that came after can be adequately understood without what came before. The miraculous healings that Jesus would perform throughout his ministry showed a man who knew human suffering up close, not from afar. He had seen sick people in the streets of Nazareth all his life. He had observed paralytics begging on the paths of Galilee. He had known blind people who depended on the charity of others to survive. Perhaps he had lost loved ones to diseases that no doctor could cure. When he touched a leper, transgressing all rules of ritual purity, it was not the distant gesture of someone who had never approached the excluded. It was the touch of one who had grown up in a society where exclusion was daily and painful. The meals with tax collectors and sinners that scandalized the religious of the time made profound sense to one who knew the complexity of real life. For someone who had worked with his hands for decades, who knew the daily struggle of the poor to survive, who had seen tax collectors destroy families with their demands, these meals were not gratuitous provocation. They were an extension of mercy to people whom the religious system discarded as irrecoverable. Jesus did not see abstract categories when he looked at people. He saw concrete human beings with particular stories, specific pains, fragile hopes. This compassionate vision was formed in Nazareth during the invisible years, not in theological schools in Jerusalem. The unmistakable authority with which he taught surprised the crowds who heard him. The scribes and Pharisees cited other famous rabbis to ground their interpretations of the law. They built chains of tradition that went back to previous masters. Jesus spoke from another place entirely. "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time," he said, "but I say unto you." This authority that dispensed with intermediaries was not human arrogance. It was certainty built over decades of intimate communion with the Heavenly Father, in prayers that spanned entire dawns, in deep silences that only God witnessed during those hidden years. The frequent confrontations with the established religious system revealed deep knowledge of its structural flaws. Jesus did not criticize the Pharisees as an external observer who was unaware of their practices. He criticized as one who knew every detail of the oral traditions, every gap between what they preached in public and what they practiced in private, every unbearable burden they placed on the shoulders of simple people while not moving a finger to help them. This precise knowledge did not magically appear when he turned 30. It was patiently accumulated in synagogues, in informal debates, in attentive observations during nearly 3 decades of community life. The choice of the 12 apostles demonstrates remarkable sensitivity for reading human character. Rough fishermen like Peter and his partners, a despised tax collector like Matthew, a nationalist zealot like Simon. Personalities so diverse that they could easily enter into violent conflict, would need to function as a united team. How did Jesus develop this extraordinary capacity to discern potential where others saw only limitations? Years living with different types of people in the streets of Nazareth, on the construction sites of Sepphoris, on commercial trips throughout the region. The hidden years were an intensive school of humanity. Consider the parables that Jesus told. The sower who goes out to sow and finds different types of soil. The woman who sweeps the whole house looking for a lost coin. The shepherd who leaves 99 sheep in the fold to seek one that was lost in the mountains. The father who waits anxiously on the road day after day for the son who left for distant lands. The man who discovers a treasure hidden in a field and sells everything to buy it. The merchant who seeks precious pearls everywhere until he finds the one of incomparable value. Each image comes from a world that Jesus knew intimately through direct experience. They are not academic illustrations invented to make abstract concepts more accessible. They are fragments of real life, observed for years in the hills of Galilee, in the markets of the villages, in conversations by the wells, in the fields during harvests. The parables have the smell of earth, the texture of daily life, the weight of lived humanity. The prayer that Jesus taught the disciples, known as the Our Father, condenses profound theology into extraordinarily simple words that any child can memorize. Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Every phrase of this prayer reflects concrete experiences accumulated throughout the hidden years. The struggle for daily bread of a family of artisans in a region where poverty was widespread. The debts that afflicted Galilean peasants under the crushing weight of Roman taxes and religious fees. The temptations of a young man in a world of military occupation and systemic injustice. The evil that manifested in oppression, disease, premature death shattered families. The Our Father prayer is not a theological abstraction. It is born from decades lived. The public ministry of Jesus lasted approximately 3 years, perhaps 3.5 years, depending on the chronology that scholars adopt. In this relatively short period of time, he traveled through villages and cities of Palestine, taught crowds that sometimes reached thousands, healed countless sick people of every kind of infirmity, confronted religious and political authorities, trained a group of disciples to continue his work, was betrayed by one of them, arrested in Gethsemane, illegally tried at dawn, condemned by Pilate, crucified on Golgotha, and rose on the 3rd day. The intensity is absolutely impressive. But before these 3 years of public ministry came nearly 30 years of invisible preparation. The proportion is significant and deserves reflection. 10 years of formation for every year of visible action. The silence was 10 times longer than the sound. The seed remained buried in the dark earth much longer than the tree remained visible under the sun. There is a profound lesson in this, for those who live in an age that expects immediate results, for those who want to skip steps and reach the destination quickly, for those who devalue periods of apparent unproductivity as wasted time. The hidden years of Jesus strongly suggest that preparation is not a waste of time. It is the construction of a solid foundation. Contemporary culture celebrates visibility above almost everything. Social networks measure human value in likes, shares, and number of followers. Careers are evaluated by rapid promotions and early public recognition. Success must be instant, documented, and displayed to be considered real. In this context obsessed with appearances, the hidden years of Jesus offer a radical and necessary counterpoint. The Son of God, he who existed before the foundation of the world, spent most of his earthly life in total anonymity, working with his hands in an obscure workshop, studying the scriptures in a synagogue without prestige, maturing far from any spotlight or public recognition. If anyone could have started his mission earlier, it was he. If anyone had credentials to dispense with prolonged preparation, it was the Messiah promised since the Garden of Eden. But that is not how it happened. There was time. There was process, there was patience. To help us continue producing these documentaries and biblical stories, consider purchasing our ebook with more than 50 prayers. It is a way to bless this project and, at the same time, have a spiritual guide for your journey. The link to secure yours is in the description. Until the next video.